Hello, this is Flora speaking out, and one of these days I've got to change my title. I'm 97, still speaking out, but I'll give you warning before I change the title. One thing I loved to do as a child, it was when my parents would take me to a beautiful southern state where my mother's parents lived, my wonderful grandparents. And one of my favorite things during the month we were there every year was to go to a nearby park that had a pond with ducks. And I loved being taken as a tiny girl to that pond where I could feed the ducks. I can still picture it, and make daisy chains to put on my head and to give them as gifts. And quite often, when most of the adults were busy, the African American housekeeper of my grandparents' home would walk with me. It was about a 2 or 3 block walk, rather long blocks. A wonderful woman, full of dignity and warmth. We all respected her and obeyed her. And one of those blocks had huge, enormous statues of Confederate generals. And I used to stand and stare at them as they showed them proudly on their horses, almost bigger than life size, way up on high pedestals. And I would stand and look at them and walk around them. And the housekeeper stood there patiently waiting for me. It wasn't until years later that I asked myself, how did she feel, a black woman, standing and staring at those Confederate generals? She must have been about 50, and this was the 1930s I'm talking about. So it's quite possible that her own parents were slaves. I never thought to ask. And I noticed in the streetcars, though never thought to ask about it, the dark-skinned people always sat at the back. I didn't particularly notice that at the park, there were no dark-skinned children playing there. There were some African American women taking care of white children. I never thought for years later to ask about that. It occurred to me recently that no textbook and no class I ever took really described the horrors and realities of slavery. We had movies, of course, like Gone with the Wind in the late 1930s, that showed a benign view of slavery. And in some households, it might have been that way. But I didn't realize the true horror of it till years later, and I saw one of those old early photographs of a slave's whipped back, crisscrossed with rigid scars that would never go away. And saw pictures, too, of decades later, victims of the Ku Klux Klan, whether black, Jewish, Catholic, after the Klan had finished with them. Those pictures made it real to me, imprinted themselves on my deep, deep memory and have never gone away. In museums, certain types of museums, I saw photographs of the slave ships, etchings actually, not photographs, also of auction blocks, what they were like. And again, they became real to me. But again, people didn't talk about that in classes or textbooks. It would be more the attitude, oh yes, those were terrible days, bad things, slavery. But we've moved on, let's emphasize the positive. And of course, in so many ways, we have moved on. And it's always good to think There's human nature, able to move on and change things for the better. But if we forget, in our emphasis on the positive, if we forget the horrors of the past, we will repeat them. You know that old trite saying, those who forget history are doomed to repeat it. We didn't talk much as I was growing up about the position of women. It didn't occur to me to ask why I never saw a woman in political pictures, newsreels, why I didn't know any women doctors. Yes, I knew one, just one. Any women judges, any women pastors. People's attitude was, well, look back at those awful days when women couldn't vote and had no legal rights over their children, weren't allowed to divorce. We're past all that. Yeah, those were bad times, but look how wonderfully we've done. Yes, we've moved on, thank God. But if we forget what women's position was really like, we're capable of repeating these things. We never discussed homosexuality, how gays felt. If it ever was mentioned, it was said, oh yes, back in the old, terrible old days, they used to execute them. They'd lose their families. They'd be exiles. And thank God those days, we would say, are over. Now look at all the privileges we have. We rushed on to the positive, which is real, forgetting what human nature is capable of, until we all saw the photograph some decades ago of the young gay man beaten and crucified to a barbed wire fence and left to die in the cold. Eyes tight shut, saying these evils are long past. Some evils are long past, but human nature, when it forgets, when it goes back to sleep morally, things are repeated. We need to be constantly reminded of what human beings are capable of. About 39, no, more like 45 years ago, our family visited one of the first concentration camps in Germany, Dachau. I am very appreciative of the fact that remnants of these old camps still exist as museums where you can see photographs of what they were like, and some of the barracks still standing. I remember one of them that had particularly housed pastors and priests who had resisted the Nazi regime and were put in these camps to suffer for it. We need the reminders as well as celebrating the fact that things, at least now, are better. Now, woke, the word woke, which is a bad word in the Trump agenda. Woke means wide awake. The Trump agenda is trying to put us morally asleep again to what human nature is capable of. For example, libraries and schools, they're beginning to withdraw books that might make children ask questions that aren't convenient. Teachers in one state are now being closely interviewed by the state before they're hired to be sure they're not too, quote unquote, woke. The Federal History Network, a couple of months ago, for a short while, deleted references to famous black people, such as the great Harriet Tubman, who helped slaves escape, she herself an escaped slave. That would remind us too much that there were horrors back then. Amelia Earhart, the great pioneering woman aviator, she was deleted because that reminded us too much that women in the early days didn't fly. Abolitionists, women who marched for women's vote, that was deleted for a while until public protest forced them to include them again. And now, how about this latest uproar over the Smithsonian Museum? I have an article of a couple of days ago. The White House increased its pressure on the Smithsonian, calling it out a list of exhibitions and materials mentioning race, slavery, transgender identity, immigration, in order to bolster Donald Trump's ongoing criticism that the institution is too focused on divisive and negative aspects of American history. Divisive, he's the most divisive president probably in our history. In an official unsigned article entitled "President Trump is Right About the Smithsonian," the White House called out 7 museums for their exhibitions messaging, including the National Museum of African American History and Culture, the National Museum of American History, the National Portrait Gallery, and the National Museum of the American Latino. As President Trump promised, the Trump administration, they said proudly, is committed to rooting out woke and divisive ideology in our government and institutions. Taxpayer money should not be used for things that pit Americans against one another. Who in the administration is pitting Americans against each other is my question. Yes, okay. They're embarrassed that the Smithsonian is showing what human beings are capable of if we forget our history. I just learned recently that the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, called the CPM for short, has been defunded by Congress and now is being taken down after 60 years of educational programs and culture, because they contend that spreading political and cultural views that the USA should not be thinking about, should not be espousing. This is the communist, Nazi, fascist reasons for controlling the media of all its forms, museums, schools. Don't think that way, they are saying. This is such a backward trend trying to send us back into moral sleep. Yes, we indeed want to speak of the positive. It gives us hope for human nature that we can change. But we want to keep our images of what human beings are capable of if they forget their history. I am so glad we have museums that show people like Harriet Tubman, the whipped back of slaves, slave ships, photos of women marching in suffrage parades, photos of Auschwitz and the starving victims. These will be imprinted on our memory, our awareness. But I want to end with a note of hope and comfort. There's an image imprinted forever on our consciousness that will never go away. And this is the image of the globe of the world taken from space that shows our world vulnerable, beautiful, hanging like a jewel in the dark mystery of space, and reminding us this is, after all, one world, and we are one people responsible for its health and its endurance, its beauty and power. This is an image that we are awake to and printed forever in our deepest memories. Thank God for it.